There's a tradition in forestry of fighting fire because the tradition is one of protecting the forest. The fuels begin to accumulate, the composition of the forest began to change.
These wildfires are increasingly becoming an urban phenomenon. We're not up in the hills, we're in downtown Santa Rosa. If we use these events as a wake-up call and we say forests are something that require stewardship.
This fire blows out and it runs head-on into prescribed fire treatment and just lays down.
We need to begin by mechanically reducing those fuels.
Well, there's really different dynamics in different forest types.
We were cutting 50,000 acres of old-growth forest a year.
Yeah, there was an erosion of trust that drove environmentalists to act.
And if you don't win, a special place is lost.
As long as I could remember, there had been at least 3 mills going here. A lot of distrust, fear, hate.
Log it and use the wood or conserve the land and lock it up.
This effort was getting past that on both sides.
We really need more acres of fire. We just need the right kind of fire.
My neighbor knocked on my door and said, "Shirley, Santa Rosa is burning down. It looks like a war went on down there. It looks like a bomb." Hard to talk about still.
We need to understand and respect these environments.
How it was grown. Is it safe? Is it healthy? How often do you ask that question about the paper that you use or the wood that's in your house?
So the people who are willing to find the new way and build a new community behind this sort of broader vision, that's the fellowship. That's all of us.
I was calling my mom and saying, "I think it's all gone. I think it's all gone, but I don't know." I didn't sleep for probably 3 or 4 days, and we didn't find out for about 4 days that our house was actually gone. The Mackenzie River is home for me. It's been home for my partner for his entire life. I can't reimagine my life anywhere but here.
I want to get to my kid. Oh my God, look at that.
Being a homeless teacher teaching homeless students is really an impossible situation to be in.
It's hard because, my mom lost her stuff for work. My dad lost all his equipment for work. So right now, it's been a big blessing to have people give us clothes, give us blankets, give us towels, things that we need to keep going. Even if it's the smallest thing, the smallest help right now is the biggest help to us.
Hello, I'm Joe FURIA, Executive Director of World Forestry Center, and welcome to the final episode of Adapting to the Era of Megafires, a community and expert summit on catastrophic wildfire in Oregon and beyond. Yesterday, in part one, our co-host spoke with nonprofit leaders who are harnessing the power of public-private partnerships to develop solutions in wildfire, water, and climate change. Today, in part two, our co-hosts will be joined by leaders at the state and federal levels to discuss how we can take action to adapt to the era of megafires. With no further ado, we present part 2 of episode 5, Building a Movement and Implementing Solutions.
Welcome to part 2 of episode 5, which will be a series of conversations with senior state leadership and elected officials, Governor Brown, Senators Wyden and Merkley, and State Senator Lou Frederick, who also served on the Wildfire Council. I'm Matt Donegan, chair of the Oregon Wildfire Council, and I'm very proud and pleased to welcome U.S. Senator Ron Wyden, who's a long-time recognized leader on environmental and forest issues in general and in wildfire in particular. Senator Wyden has dedicated senior staff to our Wildfire Council who've been involved all along the way. He is a friend of our cause. Senator Wyden, welcome on behalf of my co-hosts, KATRINA, HOLLAND, and Charles WILHOITE. We are very, very happy to have you here with us today.
Matt, thank you. And when I'm with Charles and KATRINA, apropos of my old basketball days, I can tell my parents I'm running with the right crowd.
Well, we certainly feel the same way. Senator, you and I go back a long ways, and on wildfire in particular. So I know this is a very, very important topic to you, and has been for a long time. I'm struck by how the topic of wildfire, the conversation here in Oregon, is how it's reflecting kind of the national conversation that we're hearing out of the Biden administration. President Biden recently described climate change as the existential crisis of our time. That's exactly the language that we use to describe wildfire in our Wildfire Council report. He more recently talked about reinstilling confidence in government and our ability to do big things and work together. That's also exact language that we've talked about all along. So I just want to start with that with you. In episode 1, we heard from the experts about wildfire that said this is bigger than we realize, bigger social justice implications. The impacts to our most vulnerable communities, not as well understood, and it needs to be better understood. And one of the things they said is, we don't want to get so caught up analyzing the problem that we fall into despair. We've done big things in the past as a state and as a country. We need vision. We need leadership. I just want to kind of hear what your thoughts are. You're a key leader on this topic, specifically on wildfire. What is your vision? What's your time frame when you think about getting to a place where we feel like we're making headway on this? And what are some of the pragmatic steps that you see to realize your vision?
There is palpable worry that 2021 will be another devastating fire season. As we know, we saw Southern Oregon, whether it's Phoenix and Talent, and here in the valley, the Santiam Canyon, and outside Eugene. I was there, and I saw communities, folks, where I had town meetings not very long ago, and they were reduced to dust. They were reduced to dust. And the reality is, these are not your grandfather's fires. They're bigger, they're more powerful. And you asked me about what's different now. What's different now is there is an urgency that I see elected officials and people who are following, community affairs saying, look, this should have been done yesterday. This should have been done several yesterdays ago. But you fail to act now. You fail to lead now. And there are going to be dire consequences for Oregon and other communities. So what I've been focused on is trying to shape the major policies of our time. I very much hope to move as part of the Biden legislation here in the next several months, really groundbreaking legislation particularly to deal with electricity, because electricity is so central, because it's an area where we've made a lot of progress and where we can do much more. So this is crunch time.
How might sort of this sense of urgency change our willingness to do big things? And when I say willingness, I'm talking about folks in Congress and our elected officials at state and regional levels. How do we change our willingness to do the big things that are necessary to really tackle this issue head on?
I've always felt that political change doesn't start at the top and trickle down. Mm-hmm. It's almost always just the opposite. It's grassroots up. And so I think it's especially important to mobilize, young people. What I've been trying to say, particularly in communities of color, is that, climate change is hitting those communities like a wrecking ball, and the health effects of climate change fall disproportionately on communities of color. For example, in Southern Oregon, some of the hardest hit communities were the Latino communities, who are already walking an economic tightrope, balancing the food bill against the fuel bill and the fuel bill against the rent bill. And they were much less able to weather these brutal fires that we've seen recently in Oregon. And if you look at the smoke blowing into larger cities, that again doesn't know geographic bounds. And according to the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America, the burden of asthma falls disproportionately on Black and Hispanic and American Indian and Alaskan Native people. So these are the real world ramifications of sitting out the push for climate change. In other words, if you say, gee, I know, I read about it, it's serious, but I got other things to do, we can't have that. We've got to have everybody all in and pulling out all the stops, because right now sitting it out means people are going to get hurt for years to come.
I definitely agree with you that this is, it definitely takes grassroots and folks who are affected by our communities raising their voices. And I think we know that sometimes even when we do that, it's still not enough to mobilize the folks that hold the decision-making power and hold the resource allocations. So from your perspective, what is it that, what is the message that will shift that political will? Because I think you're right. I think the willingness and the urgency rests with us down here, right? We want it. We want to see something done. And the price tag is billions of dollars. And when you're looking at competing priorities of a rental crisis or housing crisis on top of a housing crisis, hundreds of thousands of people dying of COVID and the impacts to their families, and sort of these competing priorities, those of us who are raising our voices may not be loud enough for folks to hear. What do we need? How do we shift that ability to hear to allocate those resources with those big price tags?
Katrina, your point's well taken. And this is exactly the time to make sure we put in the effort to get our message to policymakers. This is really getting in front of them in a very different way than you would have seen 15, 20 years ago. In fact, I'll tell you, when I was a young guy, as a young member of Congress, had a full head of hair and rugged good looks and all that. Fire season, Katrina, Senator Hatfield, who was our great senior senator for many years, he'd call us together before the summer break for July, and he'd say, well, colleagues, we're going to have a meeting on fire. And then we'd talk a little bit about a couple fires that we'd see in August. The end. Now the darn fire season is all year round. So I think it's in front of people. You combine the visibility. It is very different where people's TVs now for weeks and weeks on end have these huge infernos, and people suffering gives us a chance to get our message across. And then we come back with substantive policies, like my 21st Century Civilian Conservation Corps, which has kind of been melded into the President's Climate Corps. And then I think he got the 1-2 punch.
Thank you, Senator.
Well, thank you, Senator Wyden, for those comments and for joining us. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. We often hear President Biden say, when I hear climate change, I hear jobs. In episode 3 of this series, we had experts talking about the restoration economy, the need to build resilient landscapes. And we all know our rural communities have suffered significantly in general, and particularly over the years since the Great Recession in 2008, 2009. And then we get hit with COVID, and we're right back in the depths of economic recession at some level. So wanted to ask you, when you consider the restoration economy and the potential to create jobs across the board, this is a social justice issue, it's an economic issue, but when you hear restoration economy and you think about the work that we need to do on our power grid, our water systems, our health systems, how do we position ourselves in Oregon to play a role and benefit from the infrastructure planning and the investment that's in front of us? And of course, we had the Great American Outdoors Act approved last year, $1.9 billion for 5 years, critical facilities and infrastructure targeted, including forests and American Indian schools. So there is social justice tied into forest restoration. And we want to know, in Oregon and all the great work you're doing with your counterparts from Oregon, how do we position ourselves to benefit from those infrastructure bills and that spending with regard to forest restoration and taking care of our people and our environment?
There should always be a role for private enterprise in reducing the risk of wildfires and combating climate change. I'm very proud of the 21st Century Civilian Conservation Corps, because that would also allow us to have a 21st century workforce that industry needs to get back into the woods and reduce wildfire risks. We make the investment in public lands agencies. So, for example, they can hire additional contract crews. And then these contract crews can be involved in hazardous fuels reduction, state and private forestry work with the tribes, work with tribal forestry programs. It's really a rural stimulus bill. And the same approach applies to my bill to harden the grid, because with the funding that we envision in a public-private partnership working with utilities for system upgrades, fire and disaster safety, equipment installation, proper vegetation management. There are a lot of jobs here, a lot of jobs for young people, a lot of jobs for folks in communities of color who have felt the pain of misguided policies in the past and could see the opportunity in preventing fires and putting them out. Hey, there's a hope that the day is going to come when my community won't be at risk, A, and B, I'll walk out of here with some real skills by having been involved in private enterprise as part of these restoration efforts.
And just quickly, do you see a lot of potential for funds designated for training of, BIPOC populations and populations in rural communities? Is that something you envision? Funds designated for training?
It'll come in kind of two tranches. One, as part of the 21st Century Civilian Conservation Corps, we are going to make funds for training for those young people available. It's really a Department of Labor program, actually, and they work with the natural resources agencies. But I've also introduced with several of my Senate colleagues a separate package to focus on involving employers more in job training, which would give them a chance to work with natural resources firms. I mentioned the utilities, a host of different businesses that the public lands agencies would contract with to do this work.
Climate is just so big. Recently, President Biden has rejoined the Paris agreement, wanting to reduce U.S. emissions by 50% by 2050. John Kerry recently said, and I'll quote, There's no way any government will find or has the trillions of dollars necessary to effect this transition. And he's specifically calling on private investment, for government to work with the private sector and for the private sector to step up. We still have the forest product sector here. We've got the top-rated forestry school in the country. Maybe I ask you to kind of speak to your vision of how you might see a kind of a modern, new era forest products industry that's really harnessing the power of the private sector to drive public purpose on these federal lands, and particularly with regard to wildfire and climate change adaptation.
I just want to come back, though, to the notion that good, sustainable forestry practices, it's a win for our most vulnerable citizens. It's a win for communities that right now, come March or April, are living in fear of yet another set of fire calamities. And it all comes back to effective strategies for dealing with climate change. It comes back to working together. I gather you all have been doing some work on the Wyden Amendment, which allows federal land management agencies to partner with state and local landowners to do forest management and climate change projects across ownership boundaries at a watershed scale. And what it's really all about is hazardous fuels reduction, reducing wildfire risks, bringing together private timber, bringing together local government, reducing wildfire risks. And the reason for this so-called amendment that's been named after me is that trying to reduce wildfire risk doesn't always follow land ownership boundaries. And what this whole idea was, give private landowners, states, and federal agencies the chance to work together. That's the same idea in the Good Neighbor program, which allows states and counties and tribes to invest in supplemental forest management projects on federal lands. Same idea in the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration program, where we can get collaboration on the ground from all sides. Here's the point. If we're talking about the future and young people going to our forestry schools and the like, let's train them, give them the opportunities to be the federal land managers, for example, of the future that can use those kind of tools that bring people together, and the leaders of free enterprise, so that when they're out there finding new uses for wood products and securing their communities from the worst effects of climate change, they understand the values of not just new forestry, but particularly the idea of looking beyond fast exploitation of resources to long-term, enduring policies that are good for both jobs and communities.
Thanks, Senator Wyden. There's a lot of things that we can do to help solve this issue, right? And I think the Wildfire Council's work attempts to connect this long-term vision with immediate actionable initiatives. So can you just describe your top 3, top 4 priorities?
My top one, Katrina, is my Clean Energy for America Act. What we do, there are like 44 tax breaks today, mostly for fossil fuels. I throw them in the garbage can. And I substitute the 44 for 3. Clean energy, clean transportation fuel, and energy efficiency. Why don't we have real free market competition to get to net zero carbon emissions? That's what my bill does. It moves the whole machinery in the power sector, particularly the electricity sector, because the ball game is really about stepping up our game on electricity. And I think this is a game changer. That's one. Number 2, I think, would be as I touched on, the 21st Century Civilian Conservation Corps Act, which I do feel is central in terms of getting young people, communities of color, that kind of free enterprise, private sector economy set of experiences working with states and employers and the like. I think it make a huge difference in terms of reducing hazardous fuels and reducing fire risk. My third area would be my National Prescribed Fire Act, which I don't think we've really touched on. But we have a choice, Katrina. We can have some controlled burns during the colder weather, months where we can reduce the risk of fire later in the hot, dry summer months. Or we can just say, who cares? Let's just wait and see what happens. I think we're seeing a new coalition of climate change fighters, environmentalists, and communities saying we can do more to deal with hazardous fuels in the cold weather, reduce fire risk, and then when lightning or something hits a community, it's not as devastating as it was. And then I mentioned the Disaster Safe Power Grid Act, where we get everybody on board working with utilities and the government to harden the grid and deal with both wildfires that we saw last year and the problems we've had with weather more recently. If we're closing, I would just say that we have in front of us an uncommon opportunity for some common sense. To Charles and Katrina, I think you make great partners with Matt and the Governor's Council on Wildfire Response. And as Matt said, we've assigned people to be part of the meetings. I think you're always needed. You're going to be needed even more than usual over the next few months, over the next few years. So I guess the program's over for today. But what I'd like to do in the parlance of the United States Senate for my closing address, I'd like to make a request, and that is, if we got to wrap up for today, let's put this discussion in the to be continued department.
Thank you, Senator.
Sure. Thank you so much,
All right,
Senator Wyden.
everybody.
Welcome, U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley. Senator Merkley, welcome to the program, and please say hello to my co-hosts, Katrina Holland and Charles WILHOITE.
Well, greetings, everyone. It's so good to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, great to see you, Senator.
We're very, very happy to have you here, Senator. And we want to say thank you for all your leadership here in Oregon, but specifically on the issue of wildfire. You grew up in Roseburg. You have a family background in forest products. You personally know the impact of wildfire to our rural communities. And at the same time, you're a leading forward-looking voice on issues like climate change. And so I think your deep historical roots on this topic, as well as your knowledge of current issues, makes you uniquely qualified to really add to this conversation. So thanks again for joining us.
You're welcome.
First topic we wanted to talk to you about, Senator, is just the topic of vision and the topic of willingness to do big things. One of the key recurring themes that we've had throughout this 5-part series are experts saying from every dimension, this is a new era. This has changed. We're not dealing with what we used to deal with. And it's big. And the implications are far reaching: health, social justice, tribal impacts, water, not to mention economic impacts. Wildfire has become an issue that affects every Oregonian, and truly it's an existential crisis all across the West. And it's quite easy to get overwhelmed by that and to really feel like this is so big. And yet there's lots of cause for confidence. The country's done big things in the past. Our state's done big things in the past. We continue to do big things, and our neighbors are doing big things. We're hearing lots and lots of innovation. And so getting to a solution here starts with a vision. And I was hoping you, Senator, could maybe kick this off by just sharing with us your vision. When you look out at what does a solution look like, a decade from now, 15 years from now, and what are some of the pragmatic steps we need to take to realize your vision?
Right now in Oregon,
we have over 2 million acres that have been cleared environmentally to be treated, to be thinned or prescribed burned, and we don't have the funds to do it. And so we're just doing a small fraction of it. And so that means we're going to need a lot more funds. And in that sense, we're going to have to think, in terms of your question about vision, we need to think of our forests as infrastructure. And when we start saying, hey, forests store carbon, forests provide timber, there's a real impact if they burn because of the smoke. There's a real impact because they can destroy towns and kill people, destroy communities. They are part of our infrastructure that has to be maintained. And as we start approaching a national infrastructure conversation, which we're not just approaching it, we're in the middle of it, let's think of our forests as infrastructure. So take on climate by converting to renewable energy, do forest management, and start developing a sense that this infrastructure needs a lot more attention and a lot more resources.
So wildfire has long been the domain of the U.S. Forest Service and Oregon Department of Forestry and the State Fire Marshal and other environmental groups in the broader fire system. But for those who don't interact regularly with these agencies, especially us folks who are living in the cities and not necessarily feeling the direct impact of it, it's easy to construe wildfire as more of a rural or natural resource issue, although I think these last several years have demonstrated to us that obviously that's not the case. I would, the new era of wildfire is a direct consequence of climate change. A lot of us know that. We talk about that. And as with most impacts from climate change, the effects are disproportionately felt by our most vulnerable communities, the folks that we serve, and that's urban and rural alike, something that we've discussed in previous episodes with some of our previous panelists. So I'm curious from your perspective, on a regional and national level with our electeds, how do we build the awareness to see wildfire as a social justice issue and as a climate adaptation issue? And how might this change our willingness to do big things with respect to wildfire?
Well, thank you, Katrina. Wildfire is a major environmental justice issue. And just as you were asking a question, I was thinking about last September, Labor Day fires, where I traveled 600 miles from the northern border of Oregon to the southern border and back again, never escaped the smoke, and visited all of these towns that were just burned to the ground, decimated, destroyed, towns like Phoenix. And one thing I noticed is the parts of the town that were hit the hardest in terms of housing tended to be the mobile home parks or manufactured housing or RV parks, where the units are very close together. And so when one lit on fire, it lit the next. And there's a lot of combustibles probably in those units as well. And so you didn't see the fire skipping over it. If it got into it, it destroyed the whole thing. Whereas standalone houses were less affected. So you had some of the, if you will, folks who were struggling most with their economics were the most affected. And then you have the fact that smoke itself affects people who already have conditions such as asthma, and maybe more affluent families might be able to filter their air. Less affluent families are not going to be able to. More affluent families are going to be able to move to another town. They may have a wider support network. They have the financial resources to rent another place. Less affluent families they've lost everything. They don't have, if you will, a bank account that's going to buoy them up and put them back on their feet, and they're going to be much tougher. So certainly from many different directions, we see that forest fires do have an environmental injustice component that we need to address. So there's that fine particulate pollution known as PM 2.5. That's really, really harmful to people. And so that is a fact we need to take on. And so I produced a group of bills to try to start publicizing the need to do more about smoke. And one is to create safe areas that are filtered in public buildings where people can escape their conditions and go and breathe clean air. A second is to have the ability to have an emergency declaration for smoke damage, which didn't really exist previously. It didn't fit into our existing pattern of laws. That's the Wildfire Smoke Emergency Declaration Act. A third was smoke planning and research to study these things and develop better plans to mitigate. And a fourth, and certainly relevant to environmental justice, is protect farm workers, who are some of the most exposed during conditions. There need to be standards for how they are protected if they're continuing to work when smoke is in the area.
Senator Merkley, through a little research, I learned that we share the common background characteristic of having been born in smaller communities. With you being born in Myrtle Creek off of the South Umpqua River in the Umpqua National Forest, and I was born in the small town of Winslow, Arizona. One thing that's clear, small towns and smaller communities typically rely on a couple of larger businesses or an industry to drive their economies. And that was true in the case of my hometown, and I'm sure that's probably true with regard to Myrtle Creek. When change happens in those industries or with regard to those larger companies, it typically impacts the total economy of the area. And that change I'm referring to typically results in job losses. In the case of this series, we've talked repeatedly about climate change and the impacts of climate change with regard to wildfire. And President Biden often says, when I hear climate change, I hear jobs. In episode 3, our experts discussed a restoration economy stemming from the need to build resilient landscapes. This could provide critical jobs and economic activity for struggling rural communities, and a rare opportunity for positive social justice and to bridge the urban-rural divide. In other episodes of this series and throughout the Wildfire Council's work, we've identified the need to modernize our systems in the face of climate change. This can include rebuilding our infrastructure, such as the power grid and water systems, as well as our health delivery systems. How do you see investing in forests and forest communities fitting into the broader national push in infrastructure or climate legislation?
It does kind of set your viewpoint for life when you come to a very small town, Myrtle Creek, one of the little forest towns south of Roseburg. My father was a millwright in the mill in Riddle. That mill was shut down. An investor bought the company, sold the logs to another company, or sold the timber to another company, shut it down overnight. And we moved to Roseburg when I was still pretty small. And then when the economy was terrible there, we moved north. And so it's kind of moving with the timber economy. But I didn't spend my whole youth in Myrtle Creek. But I certainly take the sense of how incredibly important the forest industry is to small towns, to the whole culture that surrounds it. And I'm really pleased now that I was able to go back to Riddle, where my father was a millwright in a mill, the machinist who kept all the machinery running, and see that they were building a press, the first press in Oregon for cross-laminated timber, and or CLT as it's referred to, with this idea that you can create much taller buildings, 4 stories to 14 stories with wood rather than concrete and steel. I'm getting a little ahead of myself in this idea of forests as infrastructure, but it was really exciting to see new jobs going back into a small town with new products that can create a market for us to utilize logs here rather than shipping them overseas, which always bothers me. You see these log decks, logs going to China or Japan on the Columbia River, on the Oregon coast, rather than going through our mills and becoming higher value products and products that can help replace high energy materials like steel and concrete. When we have these opportunities of infrastructure bills that we're going to make our roads better and make our jetties better and our bridges better, and we're going to do rural broadband, and we're going to do water systems, let's also make our forests better as a critical component of the resource base in America. And that results in better forests that are modified to be better timber stands, to be better natural resource and natural environmental areas. So it's a win-win. Creates jobs in the woods, jobs in the trucks, jobs in the mills, and brings us together behind that vision. So I'm really pleased that the President's American Jobs Plan does call for investing in wildfire resilience. And that can mean a series of things, from reducing the combustible materials in the vicinity of buildings, to being able to respond faster to protect fires, to actually thinning and doing prescribed burns to reduce the susceptibility of our forests where too many materials have built up over too long a time.
Senator Merkley, I wanted to maybe revisit Katrina's earlier question around social justice, but in the context of building a sustainable public-private partnership so that when you look out 10, 15 years from now, year in and year out, we're providing stable, adequate funding, not just from the public sector, but from the private sector to address this long-term crisis that we're dealing with. And one of the things I would start with is just that our Wildfire Council, we included social justice not only in our mission, but in the composition of the council itself. So we did have farm workers, we did have tenants' rights folks, we had Medicaid recipient champions, we had tribal community champions. And one of the takeaways was that you get everybody together like this, and they all say, wow, this is a fantastic integrated conversation, but we've never had it before. And we don't have it anymore. There's really no institutional way to bring all those voices together. And then there's really no way to bring those values together. And so the question is, from a policy standpoint, given all the layers and layers of public values, specifically social justice values, how do we build a long-term policy framework and emphasis that sustains these investments year in and year out? I mean, the research shows that we're looking down the barrel of tens of billions of dollars of comprehensive costs from wildfire in the decades ahead. That makes these investments that we're talking about, as big as they are, billions of dollars, but a bargain compared to what the costs are going to be. And again, a lot of those costs are social justice costs. How do we harness that argument to sustain investment over the next 10 to 15 years?
Well, that is a very important question, and it's going to be a tough path to travel. And I say that in the context of forests are not distributed equally across the United States, and the risk of forest fires is not distributed equally. So, for example, you may have a section of Georgia that has a huge amount of pine being grown under almost pure plantation type circumstances, but they don't think in terms of wildfires, or the upper Northeast, where there's a lot of forests that have regrown on abandoned farmland, but they don't have forest fires, and they don't have Douglas fir. They don't have a whole different type of forest and forest setting. So we have to realize that not every senator comes from a state, in fact, only a few do, who is really focused on this question. So we have to take that group of senators and associated House members and really work in partnership with each other. And when I was thinking about this public-private partnership you were talking about, we recognize that to be able to effectively have an impact on our management of the forest in terms of thinning or reducing the susceptibility to fires, we need sawmills. Well, we need that private partner. We've lost a lot of our small fire mills, which takes me to John Day. I was doing a town hall in John Day, and a group of employees from the nearby mill came over and said, they're talking about shutting down the mill because they don't have a long-term supply of logs. What are you going to do to help us keep this open? And what came out of that, and Senator Wyden and I were very involved in how can this be solved? Well, timber sales often end up in court. So you can't really, timber sales aren't just the answer. Those don't necessary. There's a lot of arguments over what a timber sale should look like. But what if you had a stewardship agreement which was worked out with the stakeholders from the environmental side to the timber side, said this is how we can address this forest, and they refer to it as a prescription. Here's a prescription we can have for the forest, and by agreeing, it stays out of the courts. And now you can have, instead of a timber sale that covers a certain acreage for a certain short period, you can have a 10-year agreement. Well, then I've been partnering with Senator Crapo from Idaho and the Timber Innovation Act and the 2018 Farm Bill. And it's to establish a research and development program for the tall wood buildings and thinking about how we can create more market for products we can produce here, be it mass plywood, be it mass timber in its various forms, including cross-laminated timber. And so it has meant getting funds to our public universities. So I've been working to get funds to the Oregon State University and University of Oregon collaboration to do the research on how we can do these buildings. So there's the public sector doing research, the private sector saying, let's keep our mills in place and functioning, which are needed to improve the environmental qualities of our forests, both forest fire resilience. So stewardship contracting and collaboratives, which is kind of a similar thing on a much larger scale. And so we have several federally funded collaboratives, and I've worked to get twice money authorized nationally, and then we have to get it appropriated. So that will be a goal. And to allow those that are expiring on their 10-year collaborative licenses to be able to reapply for another license. And so these are different ways that we can work together to increase that sense of public-private partnership that I think will put us in a better place. But we have to keep stressing that the forests are infrastructure. And so when we're maintaining infrastructure that might be important in some other states where they have more of this or that, well, we have more forests. We need to get it all funded, the work funded together. And I might just add, one way we have looked at this is we're spending so much money fighting fires. What if instead we do a lot more work on the front end and invest there? Maybe the total cost would actually go down.
Thanks, Senator. No, I agree with you. Prevention always is a good investment. We see that in multiple industries, and I think this one is no exception. The Wildfire Council's work really attempts to connect some of this long-term vision that you're discussing with strategy and immediate actionable initiatives. So can you describe some of your highest and immediate priorities and how they connect to your long-term vision and strategy? Maybe top three or four for you.
Immediate action, a lot more money for thinning forests and prescribed burning for both better ecosystems and better timber stands and more jobs and more fire resilience. Immediate action, increase the use of collaboratives across the country and have more than federally funded here in Oregon. Immediate action, support the stewardship agreements that bring people together from different parts of the spectrum, from the environmental and the timber perspective, so that we stay out of the courts as we work together to solve the problems. Get the backlog of projects underway where we have more than 2 million acres that have been approved for action if we can get the funds to take them on. Immediate action, keep promoting the mass timber, tall building strategy and produce a lot more products here rather than shipping our logs overseas like a third world country. More jobs here and more partnership between successful local mills and ability to reshape our forests in a positive way.
Well, Senator, before we wrap up, just want to give you any last opportunity, any questions we should have asked or anything else that you'd like to say before we wrap up here this afternoon.
There is no magic solution. The forests are going to keep getting drier. We're going to keep having significant forest fire challenges, but we are not helpless. There are things we can do together to make our forests healthier, more resilient, better ecosystem, produce more jobs, and let's go to work across the political spectrum to bring people together and pursue those things that are working best.
Senator Merkley, we just can't say enough. Thank you for your leadership and all you're doing for Oregon. I know we all feel much better having you back in D.C. Fighting for us on this vital issue. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to working with you.
You're welcome. It's good to see you, and it's been a little while. So hopefully I'll see you more often down the road here.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, great to see you, Senator.
Have a good afternoon, Senator Merkley.
Our next guest is State Senator Lou Frederick of District 22 in Portland, which represents North and Northeast Portland. Senator Frederick is one of 4 legislators who actually has served on the Wildfire Council, so he's been with us throughout this entire process. Welcome, Senator Frederick.
Well, thank you. Good to be here.
And we are joined again by co-hosts KATRINA Holland and Charles WILHOITE. So thank you back, Charles and KATRINA.
Yep, good to be back.
Likewise.
And again, all 4 of us here served on the Wildfire Council together. So we've got a few years together working on these issues and have a lot to share. We've come a long way, and we've developed quite a body of work. We invited you here to this last session for a couple of reasons. First, throughout the council process, you brought special insights into what it will take for us to elevate this conversation and the significance of wildfire in the public debate. You brought specific thinking around bridging the urban-rural divide, the opportunities that creates, and frankly, you pressed the council to make the case. You expressed a lot of confidence that if the public understands this issue, and that includes the urban population of Oregon, that the public will demand action. And the second reason why we thought it would be great to have you here with us in this final discussion is that you are a direct link between this council process and the legislative process. And so you're kind of uniquely positioned to answer the question, how are we doing in terms of making our case, building public awareness, and also specifically building awareness within the legislature as to how big of an issue this is, and in particular, the social justice dimensions of this issue. So maybe that's a good place to start, Senator. You've been with us now for a few years. How are we doing?
The fact is, right now, it's not at the top of the list. We're still dealing with the pandemic. We're dealing with the economic impacts of that, the educational impacts of that, and the social consequences. Frankly, the pandemic allowed us or forced us to see the kinds of disparities that were already there that people had not recognized in the past. So it's no longer at the top of the list. But because I think we have a better sense of being Oregonians, I think we have at least a better chance of reintroducing this issue in a way that will get people interested and involved. And that's going to take some time. It's going to take some energy as well. I think one of the things that I always bring up, and you've heard this before, but I was lucky enough to get a chance to spend at least a little time with Tom McCall, the former governor. And he said something to me that I think has stuck with me. He said he was upset because most of the folks in Portland no longer had relatives in the rest of the state. They no longer went to Thanksgiving dinner and argued with Uncle George and Aunt Martha, who were ranchers or working fishing on the coast, or loggers, or growing wheat or something. They no longer had that conversation around the Thanksgiving table, and as a result, there was not a real recognition of the interaction that's important within the family of the state of Oregon about the different issues that were there. He talked about that back in the late 70s, early 80s. It is even more prevalent right now, where I have neighbors who really couldn't tell you where Bend was, or for that matter, Pendleton, and certainly couldn't find Burns on the map. It's that kind of thing that we have as a real break that's taken place, urban, rural, just in terms of geography and just in terms of family. So we have a lot that we need to do. I think we have an opportunity to speak to that, especially when it comes to things like our wildfire issues, our forests, and how that's impacted by decisions made at the legislative level, as well as at the city and even in the neighborhood level.
Thank you, Senator Frederick. Another one of the themes that we've sort of talked about in each of these sessions has been how to increase access to some of the solutions that would be required of individual landowners or individual renters and our houses folks, etc. Reducing combustibles, fireproofing the home, contributing to opportunities that would reduce our carbon footprint, like getting solar panels installed on roofs. All that stuff is incredibly expensive for the average lay person.
I think this is an opportunity. We have a need for people to do certain work. When it comes to this kind of issue, we need to have folks who are in fact doing that thinning, who are cleaning up those areas, cleaning up those neighborhoods. Well, it seems like a perfect kind of plan to set aside some things. That's how I see it as an opportunity here. And I see it as an opportunity for the state at the legislative level and at other levels, city and other levels, to take on that particular role. Yes, we have houseless people. In many cases, those houseless people don't have jobs that they could be working on. Here's a job, but we've got to be able to pay them appropriately and give them the respect that they deserve for the kind of work that they would be doing.
When we consider the dollars that are required, once again, looking at what's available, how much stomach does the legislature and others have for dedicating dollars to training people? Not necessarily, as you say, getting them a PhD, but training people so that they can fulfill those restoration economy related jobs and climate change related jobs. Well, what is your thinking there?
Now it's a different thing altogether. First of all, it appears as though we're going to get some additional money from the federal government in terms of the ARPA situation. We also have an administration that has decided that it's going to look at infrastructure issues and other issues. That's a different climate altogether. So we have a different approach at the legislature to be able to say, all right, where do we focus our money? But we have some more than what we expected, and it may not be may not last for a full year or for more than a year or so. But where can we get the biggest bang for our buck right now? So I think we can make that argument to the legislature, to the governor, to the federal folks, that this is something that needs to be done right now. We can't wait, and so I think that's going to be an easier argument to make now than we probably would have been able to make a year and a half or 2 years ago.
Labor Day fires last year, while I was working at Join, we were operating these COVID-19 temporary shelters or temporary alternative camps for folks who were living outside. And when that smoke dropped, I kid you not, we spent over $80,000 in 3 days to put people in hotels. It was absolutely worth each and every penny because it meant that we could potentially save somebody's life from breathing in smoke 24/7. But it also felt rather inefficient. In the throes of sort of pre-fire season that we find ourselves in now, what are some of the conversations happening in the legislature to be proactive, to take folks out of unsafe spaces, either living outside or living inside without access to filtration systems? Because we know it's going to take some time to get all of this stuff done. In the meantime, we're probably going to experience some wildfires. So what are those mitigation tactics that folks are discussing right now in the legislature?
Well, I've got to say, Katrina, not enough discussion is taking place related to that. We have some folks who are speaking to it. Casey Jama, Senator Jama, has mentioned this situation. The health committee folks, Deb Patterson, et cetera, in the Senate. I know that there have been some conversations, but certainly not enough. And given the kind of situation we have in terms of being able to connect with one another in the Capitol, it's very difficult to get some of those ideas together. I think the key is going to be this kind of a forum being presented to as many of my colleagues as possible in order for them to say this is a concern, because what you just talked about is really a key element that was not suggested, not discussed before.
This is something we identified as an existential crisis out here. In the same way that, flooding in Miami is an existential crisis from climate change. Out here, it's wildfire. So what do we do to keep the steady, sustained commitment here that if we don't have, is going to definitely lead to disaster?
I think that one of the things that I brought up in the council was the issue of trust. We struggle with the issue of trust in our culture. We struggle with the issue of trust in our state. We certainly struggle with the issue of trust when it comes to what's going on in terms of the forest. We still have people who are frankly trying to fight battles from the 1980s and 1990s. And I understand why, but those are not the battles we need to be dealing with. But we don't have time for that, quite frankly. We've got to find a new way of making sure that people are connected with one another across the state. That's a struggle that I don't have an answer for, but I think that's the direction we need to take in doing something on this.
We've had discussions about public and private partnership, and everyone recognizes, Senator Frederick, the cost is so significant that no one side of that equation can do it on its own. We have to have those partnerships. When you look at making a commitment to forest restoration and addressing wildfire risk, how do you approach the thought that this is not a 2-year, it's not a biennial thing, it's a 20-year commitment?
This is not the next quarter. This is not the next 3 months that we are worried about. This is the next 20 years. Now, if you want to go and really attach to a particular cultural environment, I would encourage you to take a look at the way that the native tribes have been looking at this world for quite some time. They look at it in seventh generation. That makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, our culture says things have to be settled in 30 minutes, or they're not really settled, or they're not really important. So we have to begin the process of looking at a much longer range, long-term approach to what we need to see in the forest issue, in the wildfire issues. As you said, it is an existential crisis. So we've got to bring that forward to folks so that they understand, not exactly, but they have a sense that if we are able to do something now or begin something now, we will have a better situation for our kids and our grandkids and the community around us.
I really think that goes back to your earlier point, Senator Frederick, around trust. The era of yesteryear, where clear cutting was a mainstay and a staple in the industry, caused a lot of harm to our environment. And some of the pain and damage that caused to our community sort of justifies and validates this fear that people have that if we give folks an inch, they're going to take a mile. And so how do we, foster that trust? What is that process of fostering that trust? What is that process of establishing regulation? What is that process of establishing monitoring so that we don't go back to the era of yesteryear?
Well, you've got complications on the other side of that too. First of all, there were folks who denied that there was a problem.
Yeah.
There's still folks who denied that there was a problem at all. But you also have people who believe that the goal of folks who are concerned about the environmental issues is to stop anything from happening in the natural environment.
Which brought us here.
Exactly. And so you end up with that. That's the problem. You have both of those groups looking at past approaches to the issue and deciding that everyone who questions them is at the end of the spectrum. The environmental groups believe that if you want to cut anything, then you're saying that you're going to clear cut. The folks who are in the timber industry see the environmental groups as simply stopping everything from happening, locking up roads and chaining themselves to trees. That's all that they see. Or as I keep hearing, basically filing as many lawsuits as possible to stop anything from happening. So you have those kinds of things taking place. We need to find a monitoring system that actually addresses both of those situations.
In terms of that trust building that we all totally agree it's what's needed. Oregon has been a recognized leader on this collaborative movement. I mean, when things really imploded a couple decades ago, it was communities that gathered together and said, you know what, we have to do what's right for these forests and for these communities. And they formed this new concept called collaboratives. I can't remember how many we have now, over 24 here in the state, leading in the whole country. Those folks are doing great work. And not only that, they've been doing great work for a couple of decades and have established an incredible track record of coming up with management plans that meet these multiple objectives that folks agree. And actually, one of our earlier panelists, Nils Christofferson, has been an absolute leader of that movement. And again, in this exercise of building a track record, showing proof of concept, showing that we're not talking about this old model, that this is ecologically sound and gets community support. The challenge then is, how do you take this kind of artisan approach that is very, very consistent with the fabric of our culture here in Oregon, and yet achieve the scale that's needed in order to address this climate change problem, which is so big and beyond our current approach. That, I think, is one of the main takeaways of this entire series that kept coming back and back, is that we've entered a new era and we have to be willing to try new things. We've got a track record here. And now how do we kind of take that to the next level? Otherwise, you get what Charles was just talking about, which is just a continuation of the destruction of these communities. I mean, there's a lot riding on this, and the status quo just isn't satisfactory.
We need to have frankly, some younger folks involved in this, because some of the older folks want to, again, fight those old battles. And we need to get some folks who are actually looking at the situation now rather than what it looked like in the 1980s and 1990s. The collaboratives have been extraordinary, but I think as I understand what I've seen, they've been very effective, especially east of the Cascades, not so much west of the Cascades, and that's basically, you're dealing with the issue of for a lot of the folks west of the Cascades. There's a loss of hope for a lot of those folks, and I think one of the key elements that we have to use is to try to reinstitute some kind of hope into the system, that there is going to be some kind of approach that we're going to be using that will in fact be supporting the communities that have been devastated. And that sense of hope is a basic part of that trust. If you can show that you're actually going to be doing some things for the people in that community, that can make a big difference. In the same way, I think when we look at the fires this summer, or last summer, we can see where they had problems as well. If we can go to those communities and say, all right, yeah, everything's burned down. What do we do next? What do you think we can do next that would be effective for your community, so that we can rebuild the community in a way that's going to be more what we want to see and safer? That's going to be the difficult issue.
Well, Senator Frederick, it is always so good to engage with you. You've got so much to bring to this debate and this conversation. So thank you so much, as always, for all your service. We look forward to continuing all of our work together.
Thank you for the invite. I enjoy this conversation. We've got to keep it going.
It is an honor to welcome our next guest, Oregon Governor Kate Brown. Governor Brown, thank you for all your leadership on this existential issue confronting our state. In 2018, on the heels of the Eagle Creek and substation fires, Governor Brown had the foresight to establish the Wildfire Council, which was formalized via executive order in January 2019. The governor quickly assembled a highly diverse group of community leaders from across the state and from across multiple professions. The composition reflected both the social justice implications of wildfire and the fact that every Oregonian is affected by wildfire. In March of 2019, the governor kicked off the council and charged us with evaluating our approach to wildfire and to identify needs and opportunities for modernization. Governor Brown, perhaps this is a good place to start. A lot has happened since you conceived of the Wildfire Council 3 years ago. The council produced 37 recommendations, all of which met unanimous approval. We are poised to enact significant legislation informed by all this work. And at the same time, the Labor Day fires brought an unprecedented degree of human loss and suffering, destroying entire communities, demanding vast evacuations, and causing unknown health effects. And throughout our council process, including this video series, if there's been one consistent theme, it's been that we have entered a new era. These fires are different, and the causes of megafires are all trending in the wrong direction. And so, Governor, as you look back on your career in public service and on your time here in Oregon, can you reflect on how wildfire has changed and its importance now to our state?
First of all, Matt, thank you so much for your extraordinary leadership. Really appreciate your willingness to work to implement the vision of the Wildfire Council. And it's good to see all of my fellow colleagues. Just really appreciate your hard work and your dedication to tackling this really important issue. There's absolutely no question that the impacts of climate change are very real and unfortunately increasingly more severe. And we're certainly seeing this through our wildfire seasons. So Matt, as you mentioned, last year's Labor Day fires, we saw Oregonians in the Santiam Canyon to the Oregon coast, Clackamas County to Jackson County, all faced fire and evacuation orders. Many families lost everything they had, and unfortunately, we lost some lives as well. The areas impacted weren't the only ones touched by flames. In the valley here, the skies were deep red. Days went by when the sun couldn't be seen as a result of all the smoke. Air pollution was so high and so toxic, it broke the charts. Those impacts on our lungs and our lives show the catastrophic effects wildfires have on Oregon. All of these pollutants of burned homes and cars, I saw melted cars in Southern Oregon, of forests and habitats, produced toxic ash that covered yards and peppered our streams. We are certainly learning what the long-term impacts of those fires will be on the health of Oregonians and our environment. And so much was lost. Entire communities fractured, land that was home to families for generations lost. And the beautiful acres where we camp and play are now charred and bare. So it's incredibly devastating. And so I hope that others are seeing the statewide Labor Day fire as a wake-up call, that this threat is staring us right in the face, right in our backyards, and inaction on fire is not an option. And Matt, as you are well aware, that's not the first time. Looking back, we had the 2017 Eagle Creek fire, where the fire jumped the Columbia River, threatening Troutdale and Hood River. The substation fire of 2018 in wheat fields that resulted in a tragic death of a farmer volunteering to help another farmer. These fires are no longer rare. Unfortunately, they're quickly becoming the norm. What is really, really clear to me is that we need to take a more comprehensive, collaborative response approach, and we need to make sure that the systems that we are using to respond to wildfire are modernized and updated. And that's how we ended up with the Wildfire Council. So really appreciate all of your efforts. It's been incredibly important. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Brown. So all of us here today, like most of the citizens volunteering on the Wildfire Council, wear a number of hats in our community. We see the needs to invest in so many essential public services and worthy social programs, of which you've taken a lot of leadership during your tenure. And yet the Wildfire Council voted unanimously to endorse the Wildfire Council recommendations, the 37, which to me instill a little bit of sticker shock, and I'm sure instill a little bit of sticker shock in other folks. But at the same time, we didn't see any choice because, as you just pointed out, it's an existential crisis. All the isms collide here. In episode 1 of the series, Paul Hesberg described ecosystem restoration as a transgenerational challenge requiring constant vigilance, and this applies to all aspects of wildfire policy. So we're talking health systems, transmission lines, and building codes. We need a historic modernization of our approach, as you just touched on, with so many competing priorities and an interesting budget outlook over the next some odd years and busy lives, short attention spans. How do we sustain this commitment to wildfire investments?
Katrina, that's a really good question, and one, frankly, not only Oregon needs to grapple with, but all of the Western states. And I think it's really important that the Western states work together to find solutions. I participate in the Western Governors Association. That's one forum. But it is really challenging, as you mentioned, given the competing priorities for us to stay focused on this issue. But it takes dedication and it takes commitment. But what is really, really clear is that the systems that we used to respond to wildfire are outdated and need to be modernized. The fires we are seeing are substantially, they are hotter, they are faster, they are more ferocious. So we need new techniques. I think what Oregon does really well is collaboration. We're used to making public policy based on research, science, and data. And Oregon also leads, I think, in terms of public policy, in terms of creativity and innovation. So I think it is all of those three pieces coming together in the Wildfire Council. But it takes more than just the council. You mentioned the 37 recommendations. My office, my team is all in to making sure that the legislature will pass a bill this session so we can act on these recommendations. And also, frankly, they have to be funded. And because of the Biden-Harris administration efforts, we do have the resources. So funding should not be an excuse. We have the dollars. We just need to create the political will to make it happen. So I absolutely believe that we must modernize our approach and response to wildfire. We have to build more resilient and fire-hardened communities, and of course, fund fire prevention efforts. And of course, we have to continue to provide relief to our communities that were hard hit by fire as they work to rebuild and to recover. I think we are long overdue for the investments needed. I think the price tag from the council was large, but if we start now and start incrementally, we can absolutely make a difference. And I absolutely believe that this time is different. Our state and local government, our businesses, and everyday Oregonians are calling for action, seeing the devastation, pushing us all to do better, because we have to stick to it through the good and the bad, because unfortunately the sad truth is, as our climate warms, our fires will keep happening. And we have to do everything we can to make sure that we are weaving in structural changes to sustain our focus on wildfire. Obviously, one of the tools is making sure we have dedicated funds as part of our normal budget process, like Representative Marsh is proposing, and also making sure that we have a full-time director of wildfire reporting directly to the governor, as is drafted in Senate Bill 762. And then we absolutely need to leverage state resources with federal and private partners to create stable funding. We need consistent messaging and partnership around ensuring that Oregonians are better prepared and better understand fire prevention. So I think we need to force the conversation. We need to make sure that Oregonians see wildfire for what it is, an existential threat to all Oregonians, especially our most vulnerable communities.
So, Governor, the Wildfire Council's work attempts to connect long-term vision and strategy with immediate actionable initiatives. For me, among the most moving testimony we've heard came from the firefighters asked to confront these megafires. Personally, we had one of our staff members at Join recently left the organization to go help fight wildfires. This is very personal. So we simply cannot ask these folks to put their lives on the line with larger and more frequent fires with the same resources from a prior era, just as you described. So can you describe some of your highest sort of immediate priorities and how they connect to your long-term vision and strategy?
So as I mentioned earlier, Katrina, modernizing our firefighting system is one of my top priorities. The national best practice guidelines say this clearly, and we must modernize and build out our firefighting capability in Oregon. And that's why I'm working to build that workforce, improve training, and invest in firefighting assets. But I have to be upfront with Oregonians. Firefighting is a symptom of the larger causes of wildfire, and we must confront the causes where we will absolutely never gain ground. And this means, of course, leading on the climate crisis and using the tools and methods at our disposal to fight fire for the long term. And the way I plan to do that is by implementing the strategies you all have developed through the Wildfire Council. So number one, making sure that we have fire adapted communities that as we work towards a more resilient landscape, by adapting land use patterns and building codes to create defensible spaces that protect our most vulnerable communities. We need more boots on the ground, planes in the sky, and the next generation of equipment to fight fires. Wildfire is inevitable, but how we prepare for and respond to is in our control. And then thirdly, and really importantly, making sure that our communities are more fire resilient by pursuing a higher level of thinning and controlled burning. And I know this is really, really hard to hear, but the science is very clear. Fuel reduction and controlled burning can reduce the risk of catastrophic fires. If we do not act, the consequences will be devastating for this generation and the next and the next. Not only the human toll that is very, very real, but we will again face the prospect of paying the exorbitant costs of wildfire response during a fire season that never ends.
You know, the Wildfire Council had the benefit of decades of expertise. And when you consider indigenous tribal practices, we had a millennia of expertise in the room helping us decide how to address wildfire. And we produced actionable steps. So the question is, as a chief executive officer of the state, how do you go about convincing people that this is a solvable problem?
First of all, we need to make sure that we are all working together and that there's really, really clear leadership. And I'm committed to doing that. We have to recognize what we're dealing with. And we have to recognize that the vast majority of wildfires are human caused. And if we cause it, we can solve it. You cannot address wildfire without addressing climate change. Obviously, another human caused problem. And Oregon needs to be part of a global solution. and we absolutely must lead. And that means bringing together partners, working together in lockstep, and of course, working together to make progress on this issue. I talked earlier about addressing excess fuels that we caused. This means a higher level of thinning and burning, prescriptive burning. We need to restore our ecosystems that are naturally resistant and resilient to fire. And Indigenous people knew this, and we need to listen to them and learn from them. And I just have to say, if any state in the nation can be a leader on ecosystem restoration, it's us. It's Oregon. You know, we pioneered the collaborative movement. We are the Oregon way. We have the top forestry school in the entire country, and we have the public and private resources that can partner to help find solutions. And as we work to restore the resiliency of our forests, we also have to address our built communities, making where we live, work, and play more resilient and fire hardened. It means modernizing our power grid. It means improving our public health systems. It means focusing on fire protection in the wildfire. I'm never going to get this. The WUI, wildland urban interface, and strengthening building codes. It means creating resilient landscapes. And I just have to tell you, I absolutely believe that meeting this challenge creates opportunities. We can create jobs restoring ecosystems in struggling rural communities, and we can work to bridge the urban-rural divide. Oregon is absolutely a leader on an issue of growing global importance, and it can create opportunities for our communities. Together, we can solve the problem. We have to be committed. We have to work together, and I know we can do both.
Well, thank you for that. And your enthusiasm is felt here, and it was felt, I believe, by the council, and that's why people were so enthusiastic addressing this issue. But we know, as you stated earlier, wildfire affects everyone. If you're not directly in the line of fire, we're experiencing smoke and related issues, and it particularly affects those who are most vulnerable. Can you speak from your perspective personally how wildfire is a social justice issue? Would you share that with us, please?
As we build back better from the pandemic, as we build back communities from wildfire, as we tackle climate change, we must do so equitably. Front and center, hearing their needs, responding to them with policy, investments, and taking concrete steps toward equity. Wildfire is obviously a multifaceted challenge, but when we invest in health systems so we can better treat people impacted by smoke, these infrastructure investments will serve our communities for decades to come. When we look for ways to support our rural communities, we must provide the resources necessary so they can do everything to prevent wildfire and provide relief, obviously, as communities recover and rebuild. I just truly believe that it benefits all Oregonians if we work together, build a more just and equitable Oregon. If you look as you are working together through an equity lens, it pushes you to solve the core of our problems, not just the symptoms.
I just want to say, Governor, I think your words are very, very inspirational. And I think when we came together for Wildfire Council, action, 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 that was really, that animated everything we kept talking about. We don't want to be the next commission that produces a book that collects dust on the shelf. We want to see something come out of this that's actionable. And so we did focus very much on specific recommendations, specific policies. But I think this vision that you're talking about also was very animating. And I know for me personally as chair, if there's any one contribution that I hope that this council makes, is that we rethink wildfire as a climate change issue. And as with all climate change issues, it ultimately comes down to social justice, environmental justice, and upholding our most vulnerable communities. That hopefully is a lasting contribution beyond this legislative session and even the next legislative session is that we fundamentally rethink our our paradigms with regard to wildfire, again, as a symptom of climate change and something that specifically requires social justice in our response. I want to just say in closing here, Governor, as chair, just how personally thankful I am to you and to the approach that you took here. We talked at every meeting about intellectual honesty and to be science driven and to respond to what the experts were saying and to try to check our partisanship at the door. We had folks from all sorts of political perspectives, and that intellectual honesty was only possible through your leadership. If there was a sense that there was a thumb on the scale or some preordained outcomes or something like that, it just wouldn't have been possible. And so your call for us to find the best solutions on behalf of our fellow Oregonians was essential to producing what I think is a very sound report. It's obviously a 1.0 report. There's going to be future. We have to continue to modernize and continue to rethink with climate change and all the changes out there. But I think for a first comprehensive strategy, it's a very, very good start. So again, I just want to say thank you as chair of the council and on behalf of everybody. I know these are sentiments that were very, very widely shared. And just a very sincere thanks for your leadership, your approach, your decency, and your real strong desire to do what's right for Oregon.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Katrina. Thank you, Matt, for your extraordinary leadership. Thank you for your hard work and dedication to making Oregon a better place for everyone. We can do this. Let's get this done, and let's make Oregon a better place for everyone.
This is our final session, and this is just a time for co-hosts Katrina Holland, Charles WILHOITE, and me to just kind of reflect. We've heard a lot. We've heard from about 24 guests that have provided a great deal of expertise and experience. It's left me with my head spinning in many ways, but also with some pretty firm conclusions. So very interested in hearing your thoughts. Maybe we'll start with you, Charles.
You hit the nail on the head when you said optimism. It is a very serious issue, but to a person, everyone who we spoke with said this is a solvable problem. And Governor Brown summed it up when she said, I am entirely optimistic. It is solvable because it's a man-made problem. And when you have man-made problems, you can come up with a man-made solution. So that has left me very optimistic as we close out. But it's interesting when you think about all of the people we spoke with, there's almost universal consistency with regard to the key issues. Climate change, fuel buildup, people moving into the wildland-urban interface. These have created circumstances that have resulted in significant and recurring and more recurring megafires. So that is consistent across the board. We also have consistency relating to the fact that everyone acknowledges wildfire affects everyone, particularly those who are most vulnerable in our community. So that was consistent with regard to all the parties we talked with. But I really liked Senator Merkley's comments regarding viewing our wildlands and our forests as infrastructure. If we view them as infrastructure, we view them as an asset that we need to manage and invest in, and it gets us right to that socially responsible investing or impact investing consideration that relates to the restorative economy. We are looking at a restoration economy. If we do it the right way, and all of our elected officials said this, we will be taking care of populations, particularly the most vulnerable. We will be creating jobs. And if we do it in a socially responsible way, and we do it from the perspective of impact investing, we will create positive impact, secure our forests, and use the asset to take care of the asset. And that was one of the comments I really appreciated in one of the videos that we saw. A gentleman was speaking about the forest being an asset. Well, we can use that asset if we're strategic with regard to how we're clearing, mechanical clearing, and we can use that product to help pay for the restoration of the forest and preserve our forest, and most importantly, preserve human life and health. So it's been a great process, a lot of wonderful, talented, and committed people that we got to talk with. But I think the messaging is very consistent, and I hope everyone hears it. So thanks for the opportunity.
I'm walking away with a sense of awe and urgency that hadn't been there previously. I mean, obviously, as part of the Wildfire Council and putting together those 37 recommendations, it was something that I was passionate about because it's something that had an impact on the industry that I work in, which is in housing, a pretty significant impact. And I was interested in improving the state response. But at that time, it was very much around improving the state's response to wildfire. Like Charles, I feel a sense of optimism in knowing that not only are we just trying to improve the state response, but prevent this issue, recognizing that there are opportunities and ways in which we can do so in a socially conscious way that builds our economy back better than what it was before, that provides economic opportunity for communities who are often left out, and provides sort of like a potentially solid infrastructure for how we engage with mitigation and impacts in the future, right? So for example, I was walking around my house the other day thinking about my kids. Earlier this month, I was, I purchased one of those big masks that had the little pink things on the end, the N100s, because I was thinking, oh gosh, what if we have something similar to the Labor Day fires like we did this year, and felt prepared. But then also there was a sense of like, well, in what spaces can I encourage my friends and family to get involved in, fireproofing their homes, or connecting with environmental organizations to talk about individual steps we can take to improve climate change. What are some of the advocacy opportunities that we have to improve folks' access to tools and ways that they can reduce their carbon footprint? How do we let people know about, ways to help fight wildfire as potentially volunteer firefighters? Is there a budget? What is the budget conversation that we need to have? Those are some of the questions that we're sort of mulling around and going through this process. And I think, and my hope is that other people who are watching this summit, who are like me, not typically engaged in these conversations, sort of feel that similar sense of awe and urgency and curiosity about how we can move forward with newly armed with so much information that's been helpful here. It's definitely an eye-opening and learning experience that I've certainly had, both engaging in the Wildfire Council and in this summit. So those are some of my initial thoughts. I'm feeling optimistic. I certainly don't feel like it's something we're going to be able to solve tomorrow. We may not prevent this year's fires, but is it possible we could prevent a significant wildfire next year or the year after that? I actually feel like it might be, if we invest the right tools. And it was really hopeful hearing from the governor today and knowing that the Biden administration has allocated some dollars to this on a national scale, so that we potentially might have the funds to modernize our response and modernize the way we deal with wildfire prevention. So that's kind of where I'm sitting right now.
Let's see, I'm gonna jump in front of you, Matt, and thanks, Katrina, for the comments. But you've made it a habit of pointing questions. I shouldn't say pointing questions at Katrina and me during this process. And I want to turn it on you and ask you how you're feeling. You did a wonderful job leading the Wildfire Response Council. This process, I thought, was exceptional. So we want to turn the table on you and ask you what your thoughts are about the summit.
Thanks, Charles, and thanks for the kind words. And I just want to, reciprocate. It has been, I've learned so much from you and Katrina here over the course of these last few weeks that we've been doing this together, and I've just so much appreciated your perspectives and the wisdom that you bring from the other work that you're doing, and bringing that into this wildfire thought process. And so I just want to say, very sincere thanks to both of you. It's really been pleasure. And I just have to tell you, I think, chairing this council the last couple of years, it has been an incredible honor. And one of the honors that you have is that you get brought into these communities that are affected by the wildfires. You get to talk to the firefighters. You get to talk to the folks in the front lines. You get to travel around. And I'm forever struck by humility and the modesty with which people approach you, the way that they welcome you into their communities, whether it's the firefighting community or into a small town, and they talk very openly and honestly with you, and they're very, very happy to see the state taking action, forming a council, trying to do something about this. And then eventually it turns emotional. Somebody will tell you this story about, what happened to them or a friend or a family member. And oftentimes you'll hear people say, boy, do you folks up in Portland get it? Do you understand what we're living through? Do you understand that we can't go outside for weeks at a time? Our kids can't go out and play. The smoke is so smothering. And you come away from those trips and you just feel like I owe it to these communities to do everything, everything I can. And time and again, it is our most vulnerable communities that are screaming out. And it leaves no question, it's a social justice issue, just like all climate change issues. You start to look at, what are the causes? And I'm reminded of Bobby Bruno with Warm Springs, who brought the indigenous perspective of, the wisdom has been to manage your fuel loads, whether it's through prescribed burns or nowadays mechanical thinning. This is, these are their sacred lands, and they take care of them. And they really do stress, fuel management have for generations and continuing to do so. And it's encouraging to see folks, adapting that more broadly. Folks like Nils Christofferson. This is a Oxford-trained forester that has practiced sustainable forestry from all around the globe. He calls rural Oregon home, and what is he doing? He's spending his professional life trying to build this restoration economy in many ways, patterned after what you're seeing on the indigenous lands. Same with Susan Jane Brown, trying to help restore local communities. You see the Nature Conservancy. You saw the case studies down in California, up in Washington. The scientists, whether Paul Hesberg or Chris Dunn, or for that matter, Werner Kurtz, talking from Canada about, there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that come from this. And so this case for active ecosystem restoration is very, very strong. And of course, we all know there is a school of thought that we shouldn't engage in this, and that we should only spend our resources very narrowly protecting the built environment. But you see this argument for investing in the larger landscapes, trying to prevent those ladder fuels that create crown fires, that create ecosystem destroying fires and threaten endangered species and water systems and so forth. And so I think there is this, there is a call to action to take this on at a much larger scale. So, and you see, you see California that has now established a goal, to treat 1 million acres annually, which is a very substantial increase in what they're doing today. The governor, they've now established $1 billion fund, there. And so there are signals, of this need to step up and do things at this larger scale. And we all know the obstacles there. And I thought Senator Lou Frederick spoke to this very appropriately, talking about the need for trust and the need for a willingness to try new models. And I think that's really, to a certain degree, kind of the elephant in the room, which is we're still tethered to, I think, timber wars, whatever you want to call them. But there's a need to turn the page from that and establish some trust and a willingness to do things at a bigger scale. You heard, so many of our elected officials talking that way. There are many, many signs for optimism. There's so much innovation going on with smarter building design, better knowledge about health impacts and what we can do to protect, our vulnerable communities. And then you saw all the innovation going on in water and climate, and the case study on solar. There's many examples that we can point to where we have had man-made success on these man-made problems. And that gives me a great cause for optimism. And then when you kind of break down the 37 recommendations, I mean, there's many of them that are not that heavy of a lift. It's more like reorienting systems and so forth, and kind of thinking about things in a new way. The main heavy lifts are the landscape restoration, and one that we haven't talked about probably enough, which is hardening the grid. That if you look at here in Oregon, particularly in Southern Oregon, certainly in California, I mean, that is a very substantial risk of wildfire. So as we kind of think about, stepping up and doing big things, a lot of them are going to be little things. There are going to be a couple of big lifts. I think the single most important thing that needs to happen is exactly what we're talking about here today, which is kind of a social movement. It's a public awareness. It's rethinking about wildfire as part of climate change, and with climate change comes social justice issues, and that we need to build a broader base of understanding about this, including in schools, including the degrees that we're offering, building a workforce to build this restoration economy. And so I guess as I think about for the viewers, many of you hopefully are asking, what can I do? And I would say there's a few things. In the near term, you can access our website and find the work of the Wildfire Council. We're going to provide that website at the end of the program. Longer term, I think that the demand is just the same way we're talking about racial equity, the same way that we're talking about climate change, the same way we're talking about these big issues, these systemic issues that we have to put on the front burner and make ongoing priorities. Here in the West, wildfire's got to be one of those issues. It's an existential issue. It's just not something we can afford to take our eyes off the ball. Hopefully, we'll see students coming in and starting to, look for career opportunities here as land stewards and as wildlife stewards. One of the signs of optimism I always see, I get excited when I see mass timber buildings like you see with the Nature Conservancy, and we're now redesigning the airport to use wood products as a way to displace concrete and steel, more carbon intensive. So you see these kind of indicators that we're rethinking these issues, climate change, natural resource. And I think when we start to see, more young people really educated talking about this, again, in the context of climate change, that's going to be when we know that we're really on the right track and that we're ready to make headway. And I think hopefully this conversation was helpful in towards building that. I know I learned a lot again, and I'm coming away very thankful for the opportunity to work with all of you as well as all of our guests here the last couple of weeks. And also I share your sense of optimism.
Well, I just thinking about the last words you said, and wildfire being sort of like on the front burner when it comes to talking about issues of our time. And for the West, we really don't have a choice. Like, we can't afford to not let it be. I think one of the sort of moments where things clicked for me was, well, it's difficult to, just thinking about in my immediate industry, when you're trying to support folks who are, trying to get off the street, and you're operating from a housing first principle, it's difficult to put somebody into housing if a street outreach worker can't go outside during the summer when folks are mostly outside, because in a couple of hours, they're going to go into respiratory distress from breathing in hazardous conditions. It's very difficult to talk about placing someone in a permanent or a stable housing opportunity if that housing opportunity doesn't have proper HVAC or filtration systems, and we could potentially expose people to unsafe breathing conditions and placing them in that housing, or in wildland urban interfaces with not many devices or, resources to pick up and move on. I mean, this truly is an issue where all the isms collide. It is the space where we find that the racism that we experience in our systems, the classism that we experience in our systems, the homophobia, the transphobia, all those issues are really laid bare. Who gets access to these resources? How quickly do they get access to these resources? Do you have insurance coverage to be able to cover your space? Oh, your insurance is a lot higher because you're in a WUI, but that's the place that was affordable to live. Like, all of those things really do collide in this space. So I just want to echo your comments that, although it feels kind of difficult to say that something is just as important as racial justice, knowing that my life or the lives of my family and friends who look like me could be threatened because of the existential crisis of wildfire, that racial justice kind of comes to naught if we die from hazardous air, or if we, are not furthering our public health aims. And, I think about the women who are pregnant and the mortality rates that African American women face because of underlying issues and treatments in the hospitals. What if you go into labor when folks are breathing in hazardous smoke and you can't get a bed? Like, your risk of mortality increases significantly again. So I really hope that folks take those words seriously and making it a front burner issue.
I think Governor Brown summed it up. She said, we need a vision, we need a strategy, and we need a plan to implement. And I think through the Wildfire Council, we've moved towards having and developing a vision by using science and expert information, developing a strategy, and our 37 recommendations are a plan to implement. So that being the case, the key, of course, is centering human beings and centering human wellness. And KATRINA touched on that, but I will just say you can't go wrong if you center the human being and you pay particular emphasis to those who have been socially and economically disadvantaged. We can't go wrong. And for those who say, well, fire has been a part of our lives and our world forever, it's going to happen. Well, we heard from plenty of experts who said these fires are happening more often and they're more severe. And we can't just leave it to chance. And anyone who still has that question in their minds, all you have to do most recently is look at Phoenix, Talent, Detroit, or Gates, or the Warm Springs Reservation. Because if you look at those circumstances, you quickly come to the conclusion that we can't leave it to chance. We have to implement a strategy, and I think that's where we are. And hopefully this process will make that clear to people.
Well, thank you. I just want to reiterate the key themes of our 5-part series. Number one, wildfire is a much costlier and bigger and far-reaching issue than we typically think about, and it has particular social justice dimensions. Number two, as daunting as the challenge is, there is a strategy. We have a solution. And number three, to implement that solution, we need to step up and implement. We need to implement with resources. We need to implement with a sustained social movement to see wildfire for what it is, which is an existential crisis. So I just want to say thank you to both of you. Thank you to Charles WILHOITE and KATRINA Holland, my two co-hosts. I want to say thank you to all of our guests here over the 5 episodes. I also want to say thank you to our fellow council members. I think we had over 100 people when you look at our council and ex officio on the various committees. I want to say thank you to everybody who contributed to this work. And I certainly want to say thank you to Governor Brown for having the wisdom and the foresight to form the council 3 years ago, and for standing behind us as we seek to implement these recommendations. And lastly, I want to say thank you to the World Forestry Center for doing a fantastic job hosting this online event, this critical series, and being such a great partner through this process. And I suppose the real thanks goes to our audience for staying with us, listening, learning about megafires, one of the great challenges of our time here in Oregon. So thank you again. I'm Matt Donegan, Chair of the Wildfire Council, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.